I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to this edition of On Watch. We've got an exciting show ahead, so settle in and buckle up. We look forward to you joining us on this episode of On Watch. In particular today, we're joined by, once again, Rachel Bovard, Senior Policy Director for Conservative Partnership Institute. And we're very pleased to have joining us today Derek Maltz, former Special Agent in charge of the DEA's Special Operations Division. Today, we're going to focus on national security, a few different aspects of national security. In particular, though, of course, the ongoing crisis at the border and some of the challenges facing us beyond that, because there's the humanitarian crisis that we see, and we read about and see images of all the time. But frankly, that's sort of superficial, just a symptom of the larger problem. So we're going to talk about that today. The images that you see highlight a very real humanitarian crisis. No one can discount that. But really, again, it's symptomatic of a larger problem, and it's a problem that's crippling law enforcement and border communities, and there's all sorts of consequences that come out of that. There's more to the story, and we're going to talk about that at length. One of the things I want to do is kind of refresh everyone's recollection of not just the humanitarian crisis we face, but the larger problem. And so we're going to roll some video here in a second that gets behind the headlines of what you've been seeing for weeks and for months, and addresses really the foundation of what's an ongoing terror attack against the United States. So let's please roll the video.
What you have here along the border, you have cartels, you have corrupt law enforcement, you have terrorists, and any one of those three groups could turn on you on a dime and kill you, kill your family.
34-year-old Jose Rivas is Juarez's latest victim. He was shot 3 times in the head at point-blank range while he was relaxing in his living room.
Do anything that interferes with their business, they'll melt you in a bucket of acid and not think twice about it.
We show that video because it reminds us of not just the recent sort of blitz of headlines and imagery and video of the humanitarian crisis on the border, but it really addresses not the symptom, but the cause, right? It takes us to the question of the cartels, of violence that is now bled over into the United States. This is no longer just a Mexican problem or a Central American problem. This is an American problem. And it raises the larger question of the cartels and the U.S. border and our own security. So I do that to prompt you both in the regards to really the fundamental question of who controls the United States border?
The violent, nasty Mexican cartels control the border. They control all the people and all the contraband that's coming into our country, and especially the poison that's killing our Americans every day at unprecedented levels.
And Rachel, why is that so difficult to understand in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, you'd think it'd be self-evident, right? But to Derek's point, the cartels are in firm control of the border, and there's a number of examples of this. But they've brought drugs over the border for years, but because of our lax border enforcement, because Border Patrol is now being moved from drug management, basically, to babysitting, because we have 5 times the number of families coming across the border, these Mexican cartels are now trafficking in humans. And we've seen a tremendous growth in human trafficking at the border. The RAND Corporation estimates that cartels made $2.3 billion in 2017 alone. And this is incentivized really by our laws. And the link is really not being made in Washington, and it should be. Because our laws state that if you come across the border with a child, you basically are let go. We cannot hold children for more than 20 days, and because family separation is no longer a policy, these families are released into the interior of the country. Who do you think knows this? The cartels.
Of course.
And you're seeing this all across the border now. Actually, just this week, Border Patrol announced that they had arrested 2 Guatemalan smugglers trying to smuggle in children. They arrested them for smuggling and sexual assault of children because they were trying to bring them in as a fraudulent family. So we're seeing this all across the border. To be clear, the cartels are the ones making money off of our lax border.
Derek, you know, recent reporting, the Border Patrol, obviously your experience as a DEA agent, but nonetheless a sister agency involved in a number of these investigations, but the Border Patrol has shut down all 7 inspection points in the state of Mexico. And I have to believe, from a DEA enforcement perspective, with the cartels as being the main opposition, the cartels have to be laughing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're watching all the moves. They're studying what we do in America, and they're taking advantage because they want to make as much money as they can, and they want to cause as much death and destruction as they can, because that's what's happening. I mean, DEA, CBP, Border Patrol, FBI, Homeland Security, they don't have the resources to be running around like these open borders with ATVs and flashlights and night vision goggles. And you know one thing about the media, they're not publicizing the escalation of violence against our own Border Patrol and our CBP officers with rocks. And they're throwing stuff and they're shooting things at our Border Patrol. It's very dangerous.
And the border, frankly, is right here. It's right where we are. Derek, you and I are both New Yorkers, and we know what the MS-13, their role. So there's the cartels themselves, and then there's sort of the retail distribution outlet, and that's in large part gangs, only one of which is MS-13. But talk a little bit about your experience with respect to gang operations, DEA's efforts along those lines, and the toll they're taking, not on the border, in New York, Ohio, Iowa, anywhere that the cartels or the gangs have been exploited or used as the distribution system for the cartels.
Okay, so Chris, I've been watching this evolve over the years, and like for a long time, you know, the Congress and the American public didn't realize that there was escalating very, very violent behavior in America all over the cities. Like the cartels are in like almost every city in America. They have their hubs in Los Angeles, Texas, you know, Miami, Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Boston, but they operate in all the cities because they're trying to make as much profit as they can, and they're also taking advantage of the addicted population. But MS-13, their motto is to rape, kill, and control. Just look at the breaking news story this week. 19 out of the 22 MS-13 folks that were arrested or indicted out in California, these guys were illegal. And what were they doing? Medieval crimes, like cutting people up with machetes, dumping body parts in the woods. In one case, it was reported that they cut the heart out of an individual because the individual was crossing MS-13 graffiti off the walls. And then a homeless guy was sleeping in their territory. They chopped him up. So the MS-13 are acting as like the U.S. sicarios, the hitmen for the cartels. So it's increasingly getting more and more violent, and it's increasingly impacting every family in America in some way. So our Congress has to wake up, and they have to start putting the politics aside, because this is not a political issue. This is a national security, public health emergency. And I don't know how many times you have to hear it, but they're ignoring it because they want the votes.
And if you talk to anyone from a border state, they will tell you about this violence. And I think Congress, you know, to a large extent ignores this problem. You're starting to see members from border states come to the floor, particularly Chip Roy from Texas, Michael Cloud from Texas, saying the cartels are the problem. And for it, Democrats are calling them racist. And I think that has to stop. I mean, this is incredible amounts of violence in our country, perpetuated by an open border. We can't have this political talk.
Derek provided testimony in Ohio on this very subject. So the feds, whether they're running for president or whether they're in Congress and worrying about their next election or re-election, are taking one stance. But when you shift to the state level, Derek, there's good news in Ohio, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, the Ohio Congress, not just the Republicans, they voted 95-1 in a very bipartisan decision in the House to actually, with this resolution, to designate the Mexican cartels as terrorists. I mean, this is so embarrassing that the state, government is recognizing what a national and international problem. It's not a Ohio problem. It's an American problem. But these leaders in Ohio, and also, like you said, Chip Roy and Dr. Mark Green, they wrote a letter. They documented to Secretary Pompeo that we need to look at designating these Mexican cartels as terrorists. I mean, they are so ruthless and their violence is so bad. It's worse than Afghanistan. It's worse than Iraq. It's worse than Africa and some of these African countries. I mean, just look what they're doing. They're chopping off heads. They're throwing people in acid. They're bombing government buildings. They're killing judges. They're killing newspaper reporters, media. They're trying to intimidate everybody. They're chopping heads off, putting them on fence posts with signs on them. They are every single day causing death and destruction. And by the way, Chris, the murder rates in Mexico are escalating through the roof. And you know what nobody talks about? is all the disappearances.
Correct.
They have the Sinaloa cartel has, like, for example, the stew maker. He dumps like hundreds of bodies into acid, and then they find bones. I mean, this is stuff that we haven't seen anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But it's right over our border. But what people are missing, this is not a border issue.
Correct.
This is all over America. And go talk to the families that are losing their loved ones every day at unprecedented levels.
And I think that that is the importance of the action in Ohio, because at the state level, and it's a little counterintuitive, because what's a state going to do about declaring an organization a terrorist? But it's significant, I think, because what it does is it creates political pressure. When these congressmen go back to their home states, they have to face the question of, well, look, our state declared cartels to be terrorist organizations. What are you doing about it? And it creates a certain synergy. And we've seen this with other sort of political agenda items where states take action in an effort to kind of build support or interest in moving something. But these federal legislators, other executives, even administrators and folks in the bureaucracy, they see a state like Ohio stepping up and addressing the issue. It almost puts federal officials in an awkward position.
States are the ones dealing with the problem.
Right.
They're the ones closest to it, particularly on the border states. And I think they're fed up, quite honestly, with Washington talking a lot, but doing absolutely nothing. And they're about to go home for a month.
Part of the Ohio effort, I'm proud to say, is Judicial Watch put out a paper not too long ago explaining exactly how the president could designate cartels to be foreign terrorist organizations. And surprise, surprise, there's significant pushback from some people in the administration, from other agencies. They're almost afraid to do it. And the beauty of designating cartels as terrorist organizations is that it radically changes the game. It takes us off of defense. It takes us off of a position of playing cops and robbers and chasing bad guys around, and allows us to go on the offense, and allows us to take the fight through both intelligence and armed forces and other means, take the fight to the cartels. Derek, what would that look like? What are some of the ways in which we could shift the game with respect to designating cartels as terrorist organizations?
Okay, so I'll give you a perfect example. I mean, look at Hezbollah, right? One of the most technically capable terrorist organizations in the world. And the DEA and our agency counterpart friends, we put together an initiative, Project Cassandra, and we identified a scheme of $200 million a month going through banks, impacting on national security with these Hezbollah guys. But the point is that Hezbollah was moving the proceeds of Los Zetas Mexican cartel cocaine, right? 85,000 kilos worth. So the Mexicans are taking advantage of all the criminal monies to actually just grow their enterprise, right? But if you have all the unity of effort of government, intelligence community, Department of Defense, and law enforcement using all their authorities and their capabilities, going after designated terrorists as opposed to criminals, where they're still looking at it as criminal networks on the southwest border, right? Then you're going to put the best and the brightest in the U.S. government that are paid to protect Americans going after the threat. And so I've seen what the intelligence community and DOD and law enforcement can do when they get the support. Right now, Congress is not supporting them. The president, thank God, recognizes that public safety and national security is a top priority. So he recognized that we have to declare them terrorists, but he needs his agency heads to step up and do what's right. And stop worrying about yourself and stop worrying about your future job. Worry about the people that are dying, because they're making informed decisions based on facts to continue to worry about their futures and their bank accounts.
And that is a problem when it comes to sort of institutional preservation and some careerism.
Careerism, I like that word, yes.
It's opportunistic, but it's careerism on the part of some officials because they've got their little rice bowl and they want to preserve what they have, or they're looking at, well, gee, I'm going to retire in 18 months, and what do I do, and where do I go? And
right.
that influences, in a
Chris,
very scary way, it influences decisions.
They don't want to taint their reputations out there in the big industry. They don't want to taint themselves as being too aggressive or siding with the president. But all the president is trying to do is keep Americans safe.
Rachel, it really comes down to political will, doesn't it? I mean, it's really at the root of it, is there the will to do it?
No, I think that's absolutely right.
We've talked a lot about, obviously, the cartels, and we've talked about sort of the humanitarian impact on the border. But two things that don't get talked about very much, or they're sort of dismissed, really, in a very condescending, obnoxious way, at least in my opinion, is what is the intelligence and terror threat on the border? we've got this incredibly porous border. I can tell you that Judicial Watch has conducted a 7-year-long investigation in the El Paso area looking at all sorts of public corruption, law enforcement officials, the drug cartels themselves, of course, human smuggling, drug trafficking, a wealth of issues. And the thing that always strikes me, and I know this from very well-placed, very well-informed sources on both sides of the border, is that there's an entire process in Mexico where Mohammed becomes Manuel. That's the expression that was used with me. That's not my cultural insensitivity. That's the remark that was offered to me. And we know, and there's been substantial documentation from records we've obtained through litigation. We've sued to get records at the State Department and other law enforcement agencies. And the State Department, in fact, produced a record to us noting how they knew that there were 2 cells or 2 organizations operating in Juarez that specialized in moving what they referred to as Arabs, that was their language, across the border into the United States. And the way that it was explained is, look, a guy arrives, let's say in the port of Tampico, Mexico, and for about $1,500, he gets legitimate Mexican documentation. Driver's license, they have a voter identification card in Mexico that we're not capable of implementing. And then he moves essentially for training. He gets language, culture, clothing, all the sort of tools to be assimilated into Mexican society. And then eventually makes his way to the border. And the way I describe it is those persons being infiltrated are essentially raindrops in an ocean wave, right? You can't pick them out because it's just such a mass of humanity. How would you pick out this one particular individual based on clothing, language, et cetera? All the sort of screening things that our agents do. So that's one aspect of it. And we know also that the chief of Al-Qaeda in North America, a guy named Adnan al-Shukr Juma, who now is reportedly deceased, thank goodness, but he flew into a small community airport outside of El Paso to organize a terror attack in Chicago back in 2009. This is the worst kept secret in federal law enforcement. And so you've got our exposure, our vulnerability from the intelligence side of things and from the terror world that is rarely addressed or discussed. Derek, this has got to be the worst kept secret in law enforcement. The border is porous. What's the sensitivity? What's the awareness, do you think, of the exposure that we face?
Well, for one, like they fixate on these statistics at the POEs, right?
The ports of entry.
Yeah, the ports of entry and, the border, we don't need a wall, but we have no idea what's coming across the border in the middle of the night. There's not enough resources. The poor, like Rachel said, the poor resources are babysitting. They're focusing on these massive amounts of people that they're trying to process, and they're not out there on the border, and the people are walking across, so we have no idea who's coming in. But the issue becomes that these people then go to the cities in America, they set up their shops. Look at Ali Karani, for example. He was convicted in New York City. Great job by U.S. law enforcement, but he was here on behalf of Hezbollah, looking at JFK Airport, looking at different government buildings, the FBI Federal Plaza, and they're looking to take action in our cities. That's because these people have the ability to cross over the border. They get their false identification, like you said. But Chris, you know what's really sad? We were doing a big case 12 years ago on a guy who's convicted billionaire arms trafficker, okay? He asked our informants during an undercover operation to get him hundreds of passports so in Central America to put his Middle Eastern friends on the passports because he wanted to get him in America. He hated America. He was a Syrian-born arms trafficker providing arms to all these terrorists around the world. We convicted him on terrorism charges. But the point is that this didn't stop. It's just getting worse.
Right. And
Venezuela and all the Hezbollah cells and the Quds Force cells that are operating in Venezuela with the drug cartels and the tri-border of South America. They're here. They're in our Western Hemisphere. And they're coming across the border as we're sitting here talking about it. And the Beltway is sleeping. And so this is a problem. And when something bad happens, then they're going to want to blame the FBI or the Border Patrol or President Trump when they did nothing to support the overall initiatives.
The old expression is that we have to be good or right all the time, and the bad guys only have to be
exactly.
right once.
Chris, the other thing too, which a lot of people don't talk about, is the increased use of emerging technologies that law enforcement has no visibility. We hear about the going dark, issues, right? But the going dark, it's not just for the terrorism cases, it's for all these criminal cases that link into terrorism.
And so when you say going dark, what you're talking about is the use of encryption and other apps, other technologies to either mask or screen clandestine communications essentially between operating
Right,
elements.
because they know that law enforcement pursuant to court judicialized processes can get into their content of their communications, but not if they're using encrypted apps from around the world. But Congress is sleeping on that one as well. So when something bad happens, they're going to look to blame, like, why didn't we stop that? Because you're not doing your job. It's not going to get better.
This is common sense, right? Don't you think that terrorists would wish to use a porous southern border to conduct scouting, recruitment, training, and then launch operations? Of course they would.
What do you expect is going to happen when you don't secure the border and when you don't resource the people on the border? When you talk to these members, not the members that go down and tour the facilities and then give hysterical press conferences in front of parking lots, not those members,
right?
But the members who actually spend time with Border Patrol, they come back and they tell you how bad the technology is. We aren't giving them the resources to even do this job.
The other thing, Chris, just think about how ignorant the statement of abolishing ICE is. They don't even realize what ICE does.
Correct.
They think ICE is patrolling the border. They don't realize that they're doing web cases all over, dark web cases, taking down child molesters, taking down drug smugglers, arms smugglers, proliferation. Like, ICE is phenomenal, and they're doing work that these rookie congressional Democrats don't even realize what they do.
Well, so we're talking about military spending. Let's shift to our friend Tony Shaffer, a retired Army officer, and now the head of the London Center, also an intelligence officer. Tony, when you hear about military spending, jam-packed with all kinds of stray cats and dogs and then wrapped in the flag, what's your gut reaction as a former Army officer?
Well, it's a shame, and I think, dare I say, anti-American. We have seen the use of these political programs intertwined with defense programs for a while now, where everybody wants to get their issue attached to a legitimate budget line items, and I think this is where we need to draw a line. I look back at the Reagan administration for a solution. The Reagan folks put together a defense strategy which was the focus of the funding, not the other way around. Right now, and while I understand why the White House wants to kick the can down the road with a continuing resolution, it doesn't solve a darn thing. There are large legitimate programs such as the F-35, which is completely wasteful, will never deliver, which needs to be re-examined. At the same time, you now have social programs being insinuated in there. It's a mess. So it doesn't benefit the people to have an expensive military. We need an effective military. And one of the ways you make that military effective is you establish an understanding of threat, you establish capabilities to defeat that threat, and you fund that. And we ain't anywhere in the ballpark right now.
Derek, I know that you've been on the receiving end of constraints on budgets. The DEA obviously doesn't get always what it wants, or it runs up against the end of the FY spending crisis.
Yeah, and this is going back to what Tony said. I mean, the threats are just increasing to this country, right? So you would think they have to be more focused on what capabilities do we need to defend this country. Like, you look at the cyber threats, which is kind of underreported. Maybe that's a good thing. But like right now, as we're sitting here, I'm surprised the lights aren't going out because they have control of our lighting, our financial industry. And these cyber armies that are around the world, it's not cheap to get this funding, but you have to understand the threats first, and we don't have the expertise in some areas.
And I'll tell you, Derek, among other issues that are unaddressed, you can almost be sure that the military spending that Rachel has written about in a great article, those are the items that will not be addressed.
Yeah, I know. That's the sad part. It's very devious, too.
So, folks, I want you to put on your predictor cap, your thinking cap, and let's look out to the 2020 election. We've talked about all different forms of threats to the country, threats to the nation, whether it's foreign threats with respect to the cartels, drug trafficking, human smuggling, MS-13. We've talked about military spending, all these issues relating to national security. I want to touch on something that doesn't get a lot of attention. There's been some sensational video on it in some reporting, but I want to talk about domestic terror. As we march up to the 2020 election, my own feeling is we're going to see an exponential increase in craziness. And when I say craziness, I'm talking about not just weird behavior, but actually real violent threats to persons and property. So look ahead. Imagine the walk up to the 2020 election. When it comes to domestic terrorism, How about sort of the violent acting out of groups like Antifa? Tony, what do you think about domestic terror? What are we going to be looking at?
I was meeting with Colonel Chris Costa, the director of the Spy Museum here in town a few days ago, and I asked him a question at a seminar we had. I said, what is the most, what thing do you regret during the time of the White House? He was President Trump's counterterrorism advisor for the first year. What do you regret not getting to? He said, domestic terror. Because there are clear issues now coming up that we have to deal with regarding Antifa. And there's this underlying kind of simmering thing that we dealt with in the 80s as the Army, which was the homegrown, there is some level of right-wing terror. The neo-Nazi groups who actually do exist. And it's funny, when you call everybody neo-Nazi, the neo-Nazis get a pass, so you don't even get looked at. And there's folks who are getting training in the military, taking that training, going into biker gangs, and kind of hibernating. So I am concerned that if you have an uprising in Antifa, you may see an analog on the other side. So,
Derek, what's federal law enforcement worried about? How are they postured for this kind of a thing?
Well, they're worried because they have overwhelming threats. I mean, the FBI, every day they're getting calls about international terrorism. They're trying to focus on the domestic terrorism. The police are not even going out on the street to enforce the laws of the state because of the politics involved with Antifa. Meanwhile, they're throwing balloons with feces and urine on cops. They're spitting at cops, and God forbid they try to defend themselves, right? So the federal resources are so focused on the international threats, the cyber threats, right? And the Al-Qaeda's and the Hezbollah's, right? It's hard to focus on every single group, but then they're not getting the support. So there's a common theme. They do not get the support from Washington. And they're getting very dissolute. They're getting very depressed. There's a lot of retirements and senior level people because they don't feel supported. So that's even a greater issue as far as I'm concerned. We're losing a lot of experience because they're realizing it's just not worth it.
Derek, what's been underreported?
Well, I mean, the Washington Post did a great story on the 76 billion opioids that have been dumped into the country since from 2006, 2012. But what I think has kind of been underreported is the fact of the organized crime activity in Washington letting this happen. These corporate criminals started this epidemic, and now all these poor kids and all these poor families are getting destroyed because they need their high, so they go into the streets and they're buying fentanyl from the cartels and from Chinese organized crime. The whole thing is not being put together properly in the media. So it's they're politicizing it, but the poor families are dealing with this every day.
Tony, what have we lost? What have we missed?
the direct attack by a member of Antifa on the Washington ICE detention facility, where he was both armed and used an incendiary device, a terror attack.
And my topic is the accidental release of all the U.S. nuclear weapons sites in NATO.
Yeah.
A Canadian report written and accidentally released identifying where all U.S. nukes are in Europe in NATO. What's your greatest concern with respect to our southern border and the intelligence/terror threat?
Well, one of the things we should have done 20 years ago is actually examine Mexico as any other threat territory. Do something we call intelligence preparation of the battle space.
Sure.
You actually do a deep analysis of culture, terrain, capabilities, technology, everything else. And you actually come to understand the threat, what's there. We still don't. And what we need to do now is take and do this, because it's not simply about immigration, it's not about migration, it's not about whether we should be giving asylum or not. It's about what is in our interest as a nation to protect ourselves from. We already recognize the drug issue coming through the southwest border. We don't even know what's going through. If not for Judicial Watch, we wouldn't know about the terror cells along the border. So this is where we have to refocus the resources properly to align, to just understand. If you don't understand, what you don't understand will definitely come back and bite you, as we've seen several times in our history.
The greatest point with respect to changing the circumstances, the conditions on our border, are to declare the Mexican cartels to be foreign terrorist organizations.
No doubt.
It radically changes the game. Derek and I were speaking about it earlier. To me, that is the single greatest decision that essentially, with the stroke of a pen, the president could affect. It takes us off of defense, puts us on offense, and it changes everything about the border, whether it's contraband, drug smuggling, human trafficking, the cartels. It just radically changes the game, and it's the single strongest option that we could take going forward. And I think the impact, again, it always goes back to what Rachel and I were discussing earlier with respect to political will. So thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Farrell on Watch.